The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 21st chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues. There will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name. But not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." The Gospel of the Lord. So early on in my ministry, during one of my first continuing education opportunities, I was introduced to the concept of SWOT. That is SWOT, not Special Weapons and Tactics. It stands for Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats. This is actually a business strategy concept, but it was taught to pastors because the dynamics for congregations are the same. The idea is that whenever you face any new situation as a business, as a congregation, or even as an individual, you always have four dynamics at work, and it's important to recognize all of them at the same time. So the four dynamics are strengths. Everybody and every organization, even if it seems incredibly difficult, has strengths to help them meet the moment. Those strengths may not seem to be enough, but we all have them, and we shouldn't minimize them or ignore them, especially if we face difficult, challenging situations. And then, of course, there are weaknesses. These are often easier to note because we don't have enough time or energy or money or people or experience to do something that the new situation calls for. Weaknesses do not necessarily sink you, but you need to be honest about them because denying them may sink you. And then there are opportunities. And of course, it's easy to see opportunities when things are going great and something new and exciting happens. But opportunities also exist in difficult and horrible situations. So it's especially important to look for them, especially when you feel overwhelmed with the final of the four aspects, which is threats. Just as it's often easy to recognize weaknesses, it's also easy to see the threats, real or perceived, that any new situation will bring. And it's important to do two things with threats. First, don't ignore the threats because some of them are real. But secondly, don't simply duck and cover and allow the threats to become the primary motivator in your organization. So I learned this stuff a long time ago and often got refreshers in other continuing events that I went to. But we really got a chance to live this here at Prince of Peace back when we went through the COVID experience. As with many bad experiences, it was immediately obvious, and it became even clearer as the time went on, how this was a threat to our whole society as well as to our congregation, not only because of the health risks, but because of the ways in which our community was disrupted, people were kept apart, and support for many institutions, including churches, began to diminish. There were also pretty obvious weaknesses. For example, although we had been making videos of sermons for years, we did not have the equipment or the knowledge of how to live stream anything. None of us had ever worshiped online before, and I remember saying to Pastor Christine as we published the first online worship that we had ever done, I said to her, I'm not sure anybody's going to tune in for this at all. We'll see what happens. And honestly, if you'd had asked me a year before whether I would be one of the pastors who wanted to volunteer to experiment with online worship, I would not have volunteered. But part of the reason that we were able to manage and even thrive in spite of the threats and the weaknesses was not only that we were willing to address threats and learn new skills to deal with our weaknesses, but that we were able to play to our many significant strengths and especially to see opportunities. And that is most evident in some of the things that we are still doing today, long after the threats had passed. Those opportunities often became part of our normal pattern today. And so, for example, we found opportunities in online worship. We didn't stop that when the threat was over. We discovered that not only our shut-in members benefited, but new people began to join us because they could start out, or even sometimes remain, online when they worship with us. Members who were away for the weekend continue to still tune in. And because we really do live in a podcast culture, people who aren't around ever on Sunday morning still view our live streams later, and they stay connected and participate in our events. Even today, our online reach, and I have to use Facebook's reach thing to how many people are you doing, our reach is 100 people every week. That's our average. And it could be more than that. Some of those people probably just click on and go, oh yeah, there's church again, bah. But we reach a lot of people by being online, people that we would have never, ever reached before. And part of the opportunities we discovered was the opportunity to meet by Zoom. And to be sure, there are lots of downsides to Zoom. But the ability to meet by Zoom and the normalization of it in our culture now has vastly increased the number of people who can and do participate in our ministry teams and our decision-making processes. Often, it means people who are out of town can still be part of the discussion, and members who do not drive at night can still be part of the decision-making process. And the fact that meetings happen at least partly by Zoom can make it easier to find folks who are willing to serve. Because I remember some of the first early version of Zoom meetings that I went to, and I got off of it and I thought, this was a synod meeting. I have to usually drive an hour and a half to get to where the meeting is, to sit there for an hour and then fight my way an hour and a half back across the Cabin John Bridge, because that was where the meeting was. And it was a 5-hour experience to have a 1.5-hour meeting. This makes life easy to find people who will say, would you serve? Because it's a Zoom meeting. Tune in. Yeah, okay. And sometimes the opportunities we found were new opportunities and ways to help our community. It's not all the online stuff. As COVID began, the needs of people in our local community increased exponentially. Gaithersburg Help was overwhelmed and asked us if we would be a collection site for food where people could drop things off 24 hours a day. We had always collected food for Gaithersburg Help, but you needed to drop it off inside and when somebody was here. So that's when we began putting these bins, on both, outside of both doors, and we've never stopped that. People from outside of our congregation who we don't know still bring things to here to help virtually every day. And virtually every time one of us arrives in the morning at the doors, somebody has dropped stuff off after hours. It's a huge, huge help. Of course, there is still the threat, and we discovered the threat of squirrelization. That's where somebody puts a bag of flour or something in there, and overnight the squirrels find it first, and poof, there's just flour everywhere. Because sometimes the opportunities also make you aware of the threats, just as the threats can point you to the opportunities. And that's actually part of the point. And I've told you all this stuff about Swot because really this is what Jesus is getting at in today's gospel reading. He begins by throwing cold water on the disciples' excited impression about the big stones of the temple. And the disciples are right. They are impressive stones, even today. And instead, Jesus begins to talk about devastation and wars and plagues, threats and weaknesses. And it can be easy to read this stuff and walk away scared and depressed. But in the midst of all this stuff, Jesus points not to despair, but rather to opportunities. In the midst of all this, he says, this will give you an opportunity to testify. thanks, Jesus, but I don't really want that kind of opportunity, just as I really didn't want the opportunity of COVID. But the reality is that sometimes the threats point out opportunities you may always have had but didn't see or didn't take advantage of. Just as with the Swot concept, Jesus calls us always to be looking for the opportunities God gives us, especially when we feel surrounded by threats, because sometimes those opportunities are never more important to take than when the world is surrounded by threats. And Jesus also, in the midst of all of these things, points out strengths. He says to his disciples and to us, I will give you words and wisdom. Because the disciples heard all of this stuff about wars and plagues and all this kind of stuff, and must have realized that they did not have the strength to rise to such occasions by themselves. And Jesus frankly tells them that they are correct about this. But all is not lost, because they'll still have Jesus with them, and Jesus is their strength. So they shouldn't despair or try to pretend that they can find some kind of inner strength in and of themselves. Instead, just as we were willing to look outside of ourselves for training and resources during COVID, Jesus calls us always to see him not as a memory or a model, but as a living presence and force in our lives who will give us strength and wisdom to meet the moment. And that's probably why he says, don't try to figure this out ahead of time, because every moment is different. But if you rely on God's help in every moment, then you actually access a kind of strength that you don't have by yourself. Now, it's important to realize that Jesus is not giving his first disciples or us a recipe for success as the world around us defines that term. In spite of opportunities and strengths, many of Jesus' disciples are still going to be betrayed, beaten up, even killed. And yet, even that won't be the end for them. Not a hair of your head will perish, because God's strength and opportunities are greater than any weakness or threat you face in this life, and that God's power to give and restore life is more important than anything else you're going to face. And so the real message of Jesus' words isn't that there's a good business model for avoiding threats and weaknesses. Even secular models don't say that. But Jesus' words to us in every moment, whether the situation we're going through seems good or bad, always remind us to seek Jesus' help and strength instead of relying on our own. Jesus' words to us in every moment, whether the moment seems good or bad, always call us to look for the opportunities God gives us, especially when things seem threatening. And most of all, Jesus' words to us in every moment, especially when we feel overwhelmed by threats and weaknesses, always promise us that in the end, God's power to give and restore life will always win out, no matter what situation we face.